The first thing is, well, what do we mean by vendor management? In fact, what do we mean by vendors? Well, the reality is, of course, that almost every project leads to a need to acquire things that we don't have, either goods or services. Just look around here, look at all the goods and services provided for this project, all of which involves vending in one form or another. Multiple relationships between purchasers and sellers. So if you want to use the terms sellers, subcontractors, contractors, all mean pretty much the same thing in this context. So basically what we're talking about is managing contracts. But let's just expand on the definition there a little bit. When we talk about managing vendors, it's not just current vendors that we need to manage. We're looking at protecting the relationship with vendors, past, present, future, prospective vendors. We need to preserve that relationship because we're going to have to work with these people and collaborate with them to deliver our project. But at the same time, we have to protect the interests of our project. That comes first, but the better job we can do of managing our vendors, the better. Okay? So it's being done for a reason, but it's a good thing to do in its own right as well. So, vendors then, that's one half of a contractual relationship. We have purchasers who are acquiring the goods or services, and we have vendors or sellers who are providing those goods or services. And the point is that contracts are exactly as the first bullet states there. They're legally enforceable agreements between two parties, one of which is acquiring goods or services and typically paying for them, and the other part of the relationship, the vendors who are providing those goods or services. So we're looking to have a mutually binding relationship. And the thing to always remember is that contracts are legally enforceable. That's the whole point about it. That whole process of setting up vendor-client relationships in the first place, in other words, creating contracts, entering into agreements, managing those contracts, and eventually closing them out, in PMI terms, is referred to as procurement management, project procurement management, one of the knowledge areas in the PMBOK. In fact, it's the last knowledge area in the PMBOK, the Chapter 12. And if you want to think about that as contract management, that's fine. But for those of you who haven't taken the exam yet, don't call it contract management in the exam, call it project procurement management. And in there, we have four processes. These are the four processes that comprise project procurement management. We plan our approach to procurements in the first place, determine what we need to acquire and what the process is to go about acquiring it, what contract types are we going to use. Once we've done that, we then enter into the negotiation with our vendors. We identify vendors, we run the contracting process and award contracts. Once contracts are in place, they need to be managed. That's the administer procurements process. And finally, at some stage, a contract gets closed out. Let's take a look at exactly how we interact and manage vendors. So let's look at each of those processes in turn. A reminder of what client procurements is. It's two things really, deciding what it is that you need to acquire and then deciding the approach that you're going to take. It is the first opportunity we have to interact with our potential vendors, and the way that we interact with them will set the scene for an ongoing relationship. And vendors have long memories, so if we act like, if we get too hardball in our contract negotiations, if we're too tough on some of our contract conditions, if we bargain too hard, if you like, over price, it might mean that the ongoing performance of the vendor is less than we would otherwise expect. One other thing we need to think about is what type of contract we're going to enter into. Is it going to be a fixed price? Is it going to be some sort of cost-plus type contract, or something in between? And our choice is largely going to depend on where we're happy for the risk to exist. Now, what is another word for risk? If you had to think of one word for risk in projects, what would you use? Just a single word for project risk. Problem? Okay. Uncertainty. Okay. Incidentally, interestingly, risks are now seen as being both positive and negative. So, but uncertainty covers both of them. So therefore, looking at this spectrum, if you like, here, some of the types of contracts we might use range from basically fixed price type contracts, things like firm fixed price with an economic price adjustment, fixed price with an incentive fee on the one side, all the way through to cost-based contracts on the other side. And in general terms, where we're in a fixed price arrangement, the greatest area of uncertainty and therefore risk is on the part of the vendor. They have the greatest level of uncertainty. Let's say you want to get your driveway paved and you enter into a fixed price agreement, $5,000 to get your driveway paved. The greatest area of uncertainty is on the part of the seller, the driveway paver. They may or may not be able to make a profit. You have very little uncertainty about the price because you've signed a contract for $5,000. That's what it's going to be. So the greatest area of risk on a cost-based contract typically is with the buyer. Buyer beware in that case. In the middle, we've got time and materials or unit price contracts where you just pay per meal or whatever. That's probably what's happening in here for the catering. A bit of shared risk right there. Okay, so we need to think about the contract vehicles because it makes a difference on how we interact with our vendors. So having decided our approach, we can then go and run the contracting process. So conduct procurements is all about getting responses from our sellers and then awarding the contracts. Bear in mind, in some cases, we might have to advertise for bidders. People don't automatically know that we're in the market for a particular type of service necessarily. It's during this process that the main negotiation is going to take place. Some vendors are going to end up winning the business and some aren't. And again, how we carry out that interaction is going to set the scene for a potential ongoing relationship. Now, a couple of things to be aware of during the conduct procurements. We don't always enter into competitive arrangements. Sometimes we use non-competitive forms of procurement. Specifically, we might go with sole source or single source. The way I remember the difference between those is I focus on that O in sole source. That means there is only one vendor that could do that particular piece of work. Single source is where there are multiple vendors for something, but you only negotiate with one. In both cases, you have to be very careful. There are automatically going to be suspicions that you're exercising favoritism or something of that type. The other thing to bear in mind is if you do contract with just one vendor, what if they go out of business? What if you're in the space station and International Space Adventures goes out of business? And as soon as a vendor knows that they're the only game in town, they have very little incentive to offer you the best deal. So just be careful with both of those. Okay, well, let's say contracts have been awarded. They now need to be managed. And the PMI speak for that is administer procurements. And that's where our main ongoing operational interaction with particular vendors takes place. They deliver the goods or services, we pay for them, and we address issues as that unfolds. So there's a two-part relationship going on. We, as the purchasers, want to make sure we get what we paid for. Of course we do. But at the same time, the vendor wants to deliver against the contract and make a profit in doing so, and ideally preserve an ongoing relationship for future business. And the more that we're aware of that, and the more that we try and get that win-win solution that we talked about in the previous session, the better. A couple of things to be aware of. If we did enter into a fixed price agreement, be careful of a couple of things. Firstly, make sure that you get what you paid for, especially if it looks like the vendor is running into some profitability issues. Just make sure they don't skim the driveway and give it an extra thin layer. Get what you paid for. The other thing is watch out for this one. Very often, shortly after a vendor gets on site, they'll come along and say, now that we know what you really need, here's a contract change for $2 million. Because they lowball to get in on the business, and then you get a high-priced contract change. Very common thing to happen. On a cost-plus contract, make sure that the work is progressing. Again, make sure you get what you paid for. And make sure that resources that are loaded onto your contract actually add value. The reality is that, especially in a services environment, people providing services and expertise, the account manager is being compensated for growing the business with you. So they're going to try to give you additional staff to be helpful, but make sure that you're bringing on board people that you actually need, not just people who are going to inflate the contract costs. So be careful there. Time and materials, unit price type contracts. A couple of things there. Make sure that work is progressing, but also make sure that is the best type of contract vehicle to use. Sometimes a contract will start off as time and materials, and then it will migrate to either fixed price or cost plus later, once both parties have a better handle on what works best. A couple of other things that go on during administering contracts. Of course, contracts change. Make sure that you follow the procedures that are listed in the contract itself. Almost every contract that's written has a paragraph in there that talks about how contracts will be handled, how contract changes will be handled. And be real careful, especially as a project manager. You can commit your organization to a contract change without even realizing it sometimes. So be real careful. And make sure the contract itself gets updated once the change has been agreed. Here are some other things that go on as tools and techniques in the administered procurements area. We need to review performance against the contract, of course, make sure that it continues to progress well. Just because they started well, maybe they won't continue to do that. Do your inspections and audits. Actually look at the chairs that you're purchasing. If it's a chair contract, make sure they've all got 4 legs and that they're all plastic as opposed to wood or whatever it is you wanted. Make sure that you're getting those things. You probably have already written into your contract that there'll be ongoing performance reporting. The other thing, sometimes one party or the other in a contractual relationship will need to state that something's not being done according to the contract. In other words, a claim will be made against the contract. Those will need to be managed. You might be claiming you're not getting what you paid for. The vendor might be claiming you're not being paid for some of the services that they're providing, and so on. And all of that is only possible with good records. So the best way to show that you did indeed pay an invoice is to hold up the record to show that you paid the invoice. Likewise, the vendor, the best way that they can prove to you that something was delivered is to show you that you signed for something or that you approved something that they did for you. Okay, well that's not the end of the story. The last process in procurement management is closing out procurements. And the key thing here is doing so properly. Not just saying, great, we're done, we're out of here, and disappearing, but making sure that everything has been delivered, all the work has been completed, the full scope has been delivered as promised,